Hey everybody, so welcome to another Nordic APIs livecast. This is our webinar series where we feature core members of the Nordic APIs community to discuss some niche topics related to APIs. And today I am joined by two luminaries from the open banking world. Both of these speakers have been featured in previous Nordic APIs events, and very excited to have them back. If you're just joining the webinar, if you could just mute your voice when you come in, that would be awesome. Today, we're going to be talking about open banking and the impact that it's having on the API economy. I'm thinking we're going to have a lot of information on PSD2, the repercussions of that, how banks are adopting the different sort of architecture and different developer-facing programs that banks are using, and more. So this is our first kind of deep dive into open banking with a livecast format. So I'm really excited to dig in. Like I said, we have two speakers today. We have Gunnar Berger, head of open banking at Nordea, and Eyal Sivan, head of strategic planning at CIBC. So I'll just give a brief introduction to both of these people today. Gunnar is responsible for building a technical platform for handling open APIs at Nordea, as well as for establishing processes for handling external developers and for driving co-creation activities with third parties. Gunnar actually spoke at the 2017 Platform Summit. I was personally in the audience and was very impressed by this case study in open banking. And it was really cool to see how it had just began starting with their whole initiative. So I'm sure we'll hear some updates from him. And also we have Eyal. Eyal has spoken at the Austin API Summit in 2018. So he was one of our first speakers for that new event, as well as the 2017 Platform Summit. Eyal is head of strategic platforms at CIBC, a major Canadian bank, where he is responsible for the overall platforms and product strategy as driven by enterprise architecture. At CIBC, Eyal is the platform product owner for the API Foundation, CIBC's award-winning API platform, and the Enterprise Data Hub, CIBC's in-house big data and analytics platform, as well as driving the development of future internal platforms based on emerging technologies such as blockchain and AI/machine learning. In addition, he also provides architecture support for CIBC's innovation team and leads their technology strategy for the adoption of open banking. So yeah, thank you for being on the line, you two. Really excited to hear your insights. I mean, we're combining two different continents and their approach to open banking right now. So some great knowledge to share here today. Before we dig into these lightning sessions, I'm just going to give some brief overview of Nordic APIs. We will have a Q&A after each session. So if you are able to chat into the chat box on Zoom, we will try to answer those questions. So keep that in mind. Like I said, some brief updates from the Nordic APIs team. We do have our third Austin API Summit in the works. It's going to be held from May 4th to May 6th, with workshop days on May 4th, and then the sessions on the 5th and the 6th. Registration is now open. It's a great event. We're expanding every year with new attendees and great speakers and sponsors. So looking forward to that. And we also have the Platform Summit that happens every year in October in Stockholm. So stay tuned for updates on that. If you happen to be at our 2019 event, we do have all those Platform Summit speaker videos now available on YouTube. There's about 50 or so. They're really great. We also have call for speakers for both events open. That'll be open until the events, until we get those ready. So check those out if you have something to share. Sorry, just a second. All right. And lastly, something about how we try to co-create with people in the community. we love it when people are reading the blog, watching the videos, and then they want to participate as well. So we do give everyone a chance to kind of co-create with Nordic APIs. If you'd like to write for the blog, the platform is open for that, and you can contact me right there. That transfers nicely into speaking and even potentially keynoting with a nice speaking slot in the future. So our platform is open. So back to the LiveCast and the open banking theme for today. First up, we do have Gunnar. So he's going to talk about the age of openness. So without further ado, let's get things started. So handing the reins to you, Gunnar.
So if you, there you are. Hello everyone. As said, I am Gunnar Berger. I am head of open banking in Nordea. I have been working with this initiative since 2015, actually, when we did a strategy work trying to answer the question, how will we continue to be a profitable transaction bank in 2020? And one major outcome of that strategy work was that we needed to get up on the same technical level as what we saw as the future major competitors like Amazon and those. And I was then tasked with delivering such a platform, an open API platform. And I got that assignment in spring 2016. So it started up as a commercial initiative in Nordea, but along the way, I also was tasked with delivering the API solution for PSD2. And for anyone located in the EU area, you know that PSD2 has become the very big thing in the EU banking market lately. And over the years, more and more of the resources we did spend in open banking was dedicated for PSD2. And this year, which has been the deadline year, 100% of my people's time has been allocated to PSD2. So quick sort of retrospective on what PSD2 wants to achieve. It's actually something that wants to create more competition in the banking market by letting non-banks get access to customer data in the bank. So in short, the customer owns the data in the bank and should be allowed to share it with whatever third party they choose. And that would sort of end the monopoly on the financial relation that banks always have had. It would also create much more competition to the benefit of the consumers. So this was sort of the plan with PSD2. And we can see now that after 3 years and after the deadline in September, it has surely starting to take off. So in the leftmost graph in the map, you can see the number of third parties that have PSD2 licenses in the Nordea countries. And just a month ago, there were just a tenth of these numbers. So it has rapidly increased over the last month due to something that is called passporting, where one third party can get a license in one country and then passport it into all other countries. And rapidly, the number of licensed parties has grown significantly. On the right, in the rightmost graph, you can see how many third parties and banks have been enrolled to Nordea's PSD2 APIs over the last year. And you can see how it actually takes off like a hockey stick curve. And we expect continued growth over the coming months because we know there is a pipeline of quite a big number of third parties and banks waiting to get onboarded. And of course, you could say that all of this with PSD2 is something that we as a bank just have to give away. And for many banks, this is sort of the really downside of it, and many don't see PSD2 as an opportunity. But since we started as a commercial initiative already from beginning, we also build a platform in such a way that whatever we develop for PSD2 should be reusable for commercial purposes. What I believe will happen after a year or two is that we will see another type of players taking advantage of PSD2 and the possibilities to get easy access to a number of countries at one time. And those are the platform players. We have seen from industry to industry how they have disrupted the traditional players and taken over. And there is nothing that says that that cannot happen in the financial industry either. The only thing that differs is that in finance we are a bit more regulated. So that of course slows things down. But I truly believe that within short we will have players like Amazon and those started to dominate also the financial services market, simply because they have the size. They can just to serve their platform participants, they can start to provide cheap financial services, not because they want to be banks, but it's just because it supports their affair. And we can see here from this is taken then from an American bank, all the products they have and how that is then matched by some kind of offering from Amazon. And we are awaiting now that Amazon will enter the Nordic market within the next 1-2 years. And we saw from Germany when they entered there that they took over maybe 50% of e-commerce. So that will definitely change things for most of the players. Not necessarily hitting only towards banks, because they will also, of course, take market from other third-party providers. What we as banks can do, well, if we are reactive, we are probably not going to survive long. So if we are going to stay in the game, we also have to join this platform journey. And this is the ambition we had already from the start in Nordea when we came out in 2017 with our developer portal. We tried to create a great community of external developers because we believe that at the end of the day, the thing that will make us survive is how good we are in connecting to the producers and consumers in the market. And by today, we have more than 4,700 external developers connected to our portal. They serve as beta testers and they are there to sort of use our APIs and so on. But long term, we of course expect that we can offer them to publish their own APIs on our platform and meet other API users to be their consumers, so that we also can take a role in this market similar to what players like Amazon do. And we have some good cases already going. We have this first commercial case that went live on the open banking platform. It was a collaboration or co-creation between Nordea Finance and Finnair on a travel financing product. And here you can see how we managed to connect platform to platform in a way that is quite tremendous. And what's in it for the different players is, of course, that Finnair gets better offerings to their consumers in their network. Nordea Finance get a bigger reach. They can now reach Finnair's customers. And this is a true partnership. It's a bit surprising though, because when I started with this in 2016, 2017, I actually believed that it would be the third parties that we would co-create with. Now it turns out that it's probably mostly the corporate customers that will serve as our co-creation partners. And we see a big interest from many other B2C customers to do similar collaborations with us. There's actually a great uptake among the biggest corporates on using APIs for computer-to-computer connectivity, which then connects back to where I started back in 2016 with this, when I first learned about open APIs. Since I'm an old developer myself, the first thing I saw was the old dream of hot links, computer-computer real-time connectivity across organizations coming true. And here I can show them a case where it actually happened. So going forward, we will see a lot more commercial products coming out on our platform. We already have consumer finance, as I said. We have capital market with FX products. We have cash management with products. And we just launched an insurance product yesterday. And there is a big interest among different units in Nordea to publish themselves and reach wider target groups, but also to be able to connect in a more modern way, a more direct way, and not use just the old electronic banking or file transfer solutions. So this was my last slide. I hope this gave some interesting views for you. Maybe some questions.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much, Gunnar. Like I said, it seems like things have progressed since we saw you at Platform Summit in 2017. Maybe could you kind of go back to what we were talking about before we started the LiveCast? You know, like what is it like now after these 300 signups have come aboard, and how have you responded? Because the portal looks great. I mean, it looks like you're making great strides, both in meeting regulation and opening up some new monetization offerings with some new services.
So very many of the external developers, they have come to our portal to find the PSD2 APIs. Mm-hmm. But when they are there, we can also sort of connect to them and interest them for our commercial offerings. So if you look at it, it is so that PSD2 becomes our freemium package, and then on top of that we can offer the premium package.
Yep.
And then PSD2 turns into, from being a threat towards our business, to be actually becoming a possibility. And I also think that the third parties see it this way, because I mean, many of them understand that they have much more to win from collaborating with us than trying to actually disrupt our business. There are still those out there like Revolut and those that will like to have world dominion and so on, but most of the other third parties are actually much more into co-creation these days.
Right. I mean, you're encountering threats in multiple angles. I mean, looking at that graphic of the Amazon offerings, that must be a little scary for yourself and other banks. I mean, is it really do or die right now?
It's actually super scary. And when I saw the numbers myself on how many third parties actually suddenly had license and so on, and I felt that maybe we are not fast enough. Mm-hmm. and so I mean, you shouldn't just sit back and rest, and just because you have been successful over the last 6 months, you will continue to be it in the next 6 months. That's not the case. Everything is moving very fast, and you need to be alert and on your toes all the time. I mean, it's only by being better and faster that you can actually win this game.
Yeah, and adopting this platform model like you talk about.
Mm.
Hey, Eyal, do you have anything to chime in about here before we move on to your presentation and stuff?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me here today. And it's a real pleasure, Gunnar, to be co-presenting with you today. I've been following Nordea's work for a while, and I think you're really an example to the rest of the world on what can be done with this open banking stuff. My question would be along those lines. What kind of challenges did you encounter culturally within Nordea trying to, frankly, sell them on this concept of moving beyond compliance, moving from freemium APIs to premium APIs? I know at CIBC and in Canada in general, it's been difficult to make that argument to a certain extent.
Yeah, but I shouldn't be. I mean, if I only had a commercial argument, my project would probably have been closed down within 2 years. So I mean, it's just because we have had the compliance funding over several years that we have actually survived and managed to develop the platform to where it is today. So I shouldn't at all hide that. I mean, I am one of the lucky guys in Nordea because I have had guaranteed funding for a number of years. And I can see if you sit in Canada and you don't have PSD2, that you have a much tougher journey. I mean, it has been super tough for me as well towards the management of the bank, trying to explain why is this necessary? Isn't it just a threat?
Can you elaborate on some of the arguments you might have made in those difficult situations?
Yeah, but I can't really say I convinced them. So the only argument at the end of the day that takes on that's the fact that you make business. So the fact that we now have some valid cases on the platform, that we can show the Finnair case, that we have more cases coming, that is the thing that has started to turn the heads of people. Because up until then, I was not one of the favorites, actually. I was in the beginning when it was the hype, you know, but then the year after, it was quite an uphill for me. And if it hadn't been for we are still doing PSD2, it wouldn't have been easy, actually. But now when the deals are coming in and people can actually show paying customers, then I also know that their mindsets will change again. So it's about managing to survive this hard period between the hype and when the money comes in. That's the trick.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll talk more on that. But yeah, thank you for those insights. And it seems like you need the cultural perspective, you need management on board, and you need some sort of business case to, well, go beyond compliance at the very least. But yeah, thank you for all that. Yeah, exactly.
One more thing I can say is, of course, it also depends on how high is the technical knowledge in your executive management.
Right. It must be hard trying to disseminate this sort of API knowledge to people who have no idea what you're talking about and aren't really on board with these new financial services and new fintech solutions.
I find this notion of developer as customer is a difficult one for a lot of traditional banking folks to wrap their head around.
Exactly.
It isn't a customer segment that we've ever had before, but here you have Gunnar and Nordea making real revenue from that customer segment.
Yeah, it's a completely different
describe it as, I mean, that developer can very well be sitting on our largest corporate customers, and it's a backdoor into, I mean, trying to convince the treasury manager on the greatness of API connectivity. That's quite a tough journey, but you can very easy talk to the developers, and they can then convince their own people. That's the way I have explained it, and it's actually quite true as well. So, but what I would recommend is to start dealing with the technology companies that can actually develop API interfaces themselves.
Right.
You know, those are the easiest one. Not go for the ones that are dependent on their vendors or something. That is much tougher.
Get that low-hanging fruit, and then now you have better use cases to demonstrate, which help other adoptions as well.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you again so much for all the information there. Let's circle back on that after Eyal's presentation. So Eyal, while you get ready there, we'll just kind of give you a brief overview of what we're going into now. So he has a session on building the optimal architecture for open banking. So we're going to get a lens to better understand the drivers behind open banking and how those drivers ultimately affect the solution architecture. So whenever we're ready here.
I just need, there we go.
Yeah.
I couldn't share while someone else was sharing.
Was about to say.
All right.
And everyone, just as a reminder, if you do have questions, please enter them into the chat, and then we'll take those during Q&A sessions.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Eyal Sivan. As Bill said, I'm from CIBC, and I'm proud to join you today to talk about building the optimal architecture for open banking. Now, this is the short version of a talk that I gave at the Red Hat Summit earlier this year. Because it's a lightning talk and we've only got 20 minutes, I'm going to focus on the parts that I think provide the most value to you as an audience rather than getting deeply into what we've been doing at CIBC. So let's jump right in. Banks are evolving. They're evolving all across the board. There isn't a section of banking you can look at that isn't being affected by technology. There are fintechs, there are GAFAs, there are all sorts of pressures, even internally changing how banks do what they do. The three major categories of pressure that I would identify are rising consumer expectations. We all walk around with a smartphone in our pocket now, and we expect our banks to be able to provide a service on those smartphones. Competition from fintechs, whether it's small fintechs or the large Googles and Amazons of the world who are entering the banking space, and of course, the rising regulatory environment that introduces things like PSD2 and other regulations all over the world that are forcing banks to innovate, right? That's the word you will hear at every bank around the world is innovation. How do we innovate? And it's all wrapped up in technology. Now, what that means is banks, to innovate, are going to have to learn a few new technology tricks that they didn't know before. Things like Agile, DevOps, cloud, and of course, everybody's favorite, APIs. The rise of the API over the last few years has been quite something to see, especially for technologists who've been around for a while and know that APIs have been around forever. They've been around since computers have been around. They really just describe how computers speak to each other. But more recently, they've been given a bit of a starring role, especially in the banking space and especially in the context of open banking, this move for banks to open up their data and for customers to reclaim ownership of that data. Now, a lot of people still get confused. What exactly is open banking? There's a lot of debates. Sometimes there's definitions that conflict. The way I like to explain it is, look, yeah, APIs have been around forever. Banks have been doing them for a really long time, but we typically do partner APIs, which means bilateral agreements with some sort of strategic partner where we hook into their systems. The dev teams will sit together and sort of figure it out. That's still fundamentally closed banking. The ecosystems are closed. All the deals are bilateral. As you start to share the data and open it up and publish the kinds of APIs you see from Nordea in a public place, well, now you're getting into open APIs. That's much better. You're now providing a self-serve mechanism for folks to come and consume your data. You're treating developers like customers, but I still wouldn't quite call that open banking. You really get to open banking once you've standardized on a set of APIs across the ecosystem that everybody can leverage and use, so that you can call a single API and have access to all of the participants in that ecosystem. And that's what you're starting to see come into place as PSD2 comes online, all of the banks start to join, publish APIs in a common way based on various standards from PSD2, like the Berlin Group standard or STET. And of course, the UK is a bit of a darling. They've developed the UK open banking specification. But the point is, all of the banks are using the same API specification. At that point, you've achieved true open banking. However, even with that definition, open banking really means different things to different people in different places. If you go to open banking events, you'll often see a chart like this. This is the global landscape that shows you how all the different regions are approaching the question of open banking. This chart is from A.T. Kearney, and what it does is plot the country's activity on two axes. One is a market pull, essentially saying market forces like GAFAs and fintechs are going to pull you into this market, or a regulatory push where government comes along and says, here's a new law, here's a new regulation, you have to adopt open banking. Different regions have taken different approaches. Regulation-driven regions that are well known are Australia, the UK, and Mexico seems to be going down that road. And the EU, of course, has published PSD2. Market-driven, you see predominantly the US and ironically China. And you also see a lot of movement in Singapore and other regions to take a market-driven approach. But from a technologist point of view, they all lead to the same place. They all lead to open banking. The commonality, whether you've taken a regulatory-driven approach or a market-driven approach, is you're driving competition, you're driving innovation, and you're driving fundamentally price transparency. So the key point is that you've got these two different approaches. They both lead to the same place, the same destination. However, whether you're regulatory driven or market driven, this is going to greatly affect your solution architecture. And that's really what I'm here to talk about, is architecture. So that's where we're going to go now. The thing about regulations is they're really good at driving API development. So you'll get really good if you're trying to become regulatorily compliant with things like open APIs and open data. You'll be able to handle developer experience and put up a developer portal. And of course, you'll be able to adhere to common standards. This often means you're going to adopt some sort of API management tool or process that's going to deal with the life cycle of APIs. Now, all of this stuff is important. However, there is no regulation in the world that forces you to do anything about modernizing your back-end systems. That's where the market comes in. So whereas in the regulated regions, you have banks on a bit of a forced march to achieve the PSD2 compliance by a certain deadline, that's a limited set of IT resources that they typically have to work with. Meanwhile, in market-driven regions that are unencumbered by regulation, they've been focusing on something else. They've been focusing on something called continuous improvement and continuous delivery, which essentially amounts to delivery speed. So whereas they might not have gotten super good at open APIs and API management and treating developers like customers, they've gotten very good at things like agile requirements, consumer-driven contracts, precise scaling and enhancement based on microservices, distributed data and eventual consistency with events, unstructured big data lakes, automated DevOps deployments that shrink their deployment times down to seconds, public cloud native architectures, and this whole notion of continuous improvement in terms of culture. The thing is, to truly support open banking, you have to bring these two things together. It's not enough just to have API management. You have to modernize your entire technology stack, but it's not enough to have delivery speed. You have to have solid API management as well. So how do you do that? Well, a lot of banks that needed to adhere to open banking or wanted to go down the API road bought a gateway. Gateways also mean different things to different people. If you speak to some people about gateways, they talk about what sounds a lot like a hub with a bunch of adapters that you plug everything into, and it sort of handles all your traffic, and you don't really have to worry very much about how it works or whether it's proprietary. It just sort of stitches all your systems together. That's an approach that I've seen over my years in the industry come and go by a number of different names. Today, some vendors will call it a gateway. Before that, it was called an ESB. Before that, it was called an EAI tool. And if you go back far enough, you can get into ERP. I like to call it the magical black box. The idea being, buy this magical black box, hook all of your systems into it, and then walk away. Everything's going to be fine. I, the vendor, will take care of you. In my experience, these kinds of approaches never work. You end up with a bunch of proprietary technology that you don't really understand how it works. Eventually, it becomes obsolete, and you spend twice as much trying to move away from it as you did trying to get into it. However, when you're only focused on API management, sometimes that looks like a really attractive option. You're not really thinking very much about how your systems are going to change in the long term, so you end up going down that road. Consequentially, what you end up with is a single point of failure and a choke point that won't scale. So along come microservices and offer really a different approach, something that initially was known as a distributed gateway. The idea being, rather than having a single traffic cop handling all of your integration, spread out these cross-cutting concerns, these things that a gateway does, into each individual microservice. Enter the distributed gateway. Now, before we understand the benefits of that sort of distributed architecture, we have to understand a little bit about microservices and why they're different from APIs. A lot of folks conflate APIs and microservices. They are not the same thing, and it's important to understand that they're not. APIs are just the contract. They're the specification that says, if you send me this input data, this is the output data you're going to get back. That's all they say. They are completely independent of any kind of implementation, any kind of code that hooks them into backend systems. They are just a document that specifies input data and output data. What that means is you could take the same API and implement it on a 40-year-old mainframe or an ultra-modern public cloud environment. The API would be the same. Microservices, by contrast, are the implementation. That's what's going on under the hood. Now, microservices say, break down the functions of your application into a lot of individual pieces, because then you can precisely upgrade them, you can precisely scale them, and they're completely portable across different environments that support microservices. So let me quickly explain by example. Imagine you had a 40-year-old mainframe and it did 10 things. Now you have to achieve PSD2 compliance. Technically, you could buy a gateway product, stick it in front of your mainframe, hook it in through adapters, and publish the most beautiful, RESTful, JSON, developer-friendly APIs that you ever saw, all running on top of that 40-year-old mainframe. And technically, you would achieve PSD2 compliance. However, then your developers would start asking for things. This is what Gunnar lives every day. Developers on his portal asking for changes, asking for support. If a developer comes along and says, hey, on that 10th function that your mainframe does, I need a new field, or I need it to perform 10 times as fast as it did yesterday, you really have no way to do that without upgrading the entire mainframe application, which in many cases you simply can't do. So you're going to go back to your developer and say, sorry, I can't help you. I know you want a new field, but it's impossible. Not without some sort of wizardry. So enter microservices, which say, I'm going to split that mainframe down into 10 individual microservices, each with their own dedicated API. And now, if you want to change the 10th one, go ahead. You can do it without affecting the other 9. That's the benefit of microservices, and that's why they're so key to achieving this goal of delivery speed. So APIs make integration a lot easier and make developers' lives easier, but only microservices lead to high-speed release cycles. So it's critical you take your gateway functions and come up with a distributed model based on microservices. The thing is, even microservices are on this evolutionary roadmap. When we started down this road at CIBC, we thought it was sort of good enough to say, cool, microservices. We took an approach known as a microservice chassis. The most popular implementation is probably Spring Boot in the enterprise world. And we saw that progression from monolithic gateways to distributed microservices. Now down there in the diagram, you can see examples like Spring Boot, Finagle, Drop Wizard, Ribbon was another one, of microservice chassis, essentially libraries that entered the market and said, wrap your microservice in these libraries and you'll get all your gateway functions. You don't need a single choke point. You don't need a monolith. But about a year or 18 months ago, something else happened. Folks who were running microservice chassis said, wow, library management is hard. I can't make sure that all my developers are on the same version of the library. Distributing it is a pain. And I don't like that I have to recompile every microservice every time I change the library. The team who wrote the microservice didn't care, so why am I forcing them to recompile? And a fundamentally new approach entered the world, and that's service mesh. The service mesh says, well, take all that gateway stuff out of the microservice. There's no need to wrap the microservice in it. Instead, give each microservice a dedicated proxy, a dedicated sidecar is what it came to be called, that acts as a contact surface for that microservice to integrate with all the other microservices. Now, we're going to dive into that architecture in the next slide. But the amazing thing here is you sort of have your cake and eat it too. You have this universal telemetry in a fully distributed way, but you also aren't touching the microservices that you're sitting in front of. The big name in the service mesh world is Istio, but over the last year, you've seen almost every vendor under the sun gravitate towards this service mesh architecture, claiming to either have their own solution or play nicely with Istio. Some of them very loudly, like Kong, who've essentially changed their entire strategy to follow the service mesh architecture. Axway is another one. They used to be monolithic, and now they've transformed into a service mesh. MuleSoft's Anypoint platform also claims to be a service mesh. So you're seeing everybody gravitate towards this architecture because it makes a lot of sense. Now, even beyond service mesh, you've got this world of serverless, which does away with any kind of management of this environment. Very cool stuff, definitely worth experimenting with, but not really enterprise ready. Service mesh is really the sweet spot right now. And the rise of service mesh is not going to make things easier because it's still pretty new. And as you can see, it's still evolving. It is going to make things more volatile, and early adopters who understand that pattern and why it makes sense will gain a lead. Now, I very intentionally picked the word optimal. When I first worked on this deck, I had something like the correct architecture. But I decided to change it because things are changing every day. And the best I can give you is optimal based on what we know now. But based on what we know now, the service mesh is really perfect for open banking because you're trying to strike that balance between universal observability and management and delivery speed. So drilling into the service mesh, what you have here is a bunch of microservices, and each of them have a sidecar. What that means is a dedicated little microservice that's only providing those gateway functions, those cross-cutting concerns. And they sit in a local host environment right alongside each of their microservices. And these sidecars handle all of the communication from microservice to microservice. So they never really talk to each other directly. They only do it through proxies. The most popular proxy in a service mesh environment that really Istio popularized is Envoy, which started, of all places, at Lyft. So they talk to each other and handle all of the microservice to microservice traffic, which is known as east-west traffic. And all of their policies are controlled through a common control plane, which is technically Istio. If you want to get nerdy about it, the control plane is Istio. All of the envoys, all of those proxies talking to each other, that's considered the data plane. Now, even though I talked about fat gateways and sort of described them as a danger, there still is a point in the architecture for a perimeter API gateway that handles ingress and egress from a trusted network to a non-trusted network. Typically, that should be very thin, should be based on something like an Nginx or lightweight F5, and that handles what has come to be known as north-south traffic. The important concept around a service mesh is making that distinction between the way you handle east-west traffic, your microservices communicating internally, and the way you handle north-south to get to an untrusted network. Those should be handled differently. Finally, you see these services clustered together into domains. There is the question of when I decompose my monoliths into microservice, how do I keep them organized? The answer is domains, and you'll probably apply a design discipline known as domain-driven design. So put all this together. Incidentally, this is all hosted on top of a Kubernetes environment like OpenShift Container Platform or any of the Kube environments offered by public cloud providers. So you're portable. You can move this thing from one cloud provider to another. So in the large, this service mesh provides you this balance between precise control and visibility and traceability while still supporting speed and innovation in a fully distributed way. Now, when I first put this material together, I sort of stopped there, but a lot is happening even in the mesh world. And you are starting to see a lot of mesh providers show up in the commercial space trying to solve a bit of an advanced problem. And that advanced problem is how do you extend your service mesh beyond clouds, right? How do you start to take a mesh that is larger than the Kubernetes environment that it sits on, either by spanning multiple cloud environments, whether private or public, or by bringing in legacy systems by integrating with VMs. Some of the players you see in this space are Solo. HashiCorp is really upping their game around console, and Nginx is reinventing their platform to try and offer these kinds of solutions. But make no mistake, what you're going to start to see is this service mesh architecture evolve into a single control plane for multiple meshes, the ability to manage testing and prod meshes in a single pane of glass, mechanisms to integrate with legacy systems and VMs, support for private and hybrid cloud environments, so you can go from your on-prem cloud to a public cloud seamlessly, and even the ability to span across public cloud providers. So you'd have a single mesh, as in the picture, that spans Amazon, Azure, Google, and whoever else. And of course, hooks into your private. This is pretty advanced stuff. Not a lot of folks have anything like this in production, but this is the direction where service mesh is going. A service mesh that spans multiple clouds and legacy systems, if you can pull it off, gives you a truly unified innovation platform. And why would you want that? Well, the answer is, if you work at a bank today, you are trying to build the bank of the future. We're all on the same road. We're all trying to get to the same place. But success in that space really demands a technological balancing act. We talked about the API strategy and platform, and in some regions, you're going to have regulation helping you with that. But the key is these 4 pillars: APIs, Agile, DevOps, and Cloud. And if your organization doesn't understand the interrelationship between these 4 pillars, they're going to have a bad time. They really have to get that these 4 are dependent on each other. And if one of them starts to lag, it's basically going to drag back the other 3. You can't do APIs, Agile, DevOps, and Cloud in isolation. But even those 4 pillars, if you get them right, are focused on technology and operations and delivery of that code. Underneath that, you have to tackle organizational structure challenges. If you look up Conway's Law and the impact that organizational structure has on the technology solutions that you build, that's fundamental to adopting a high-speed delivery culture based on innovation. You often do have to break down walls and restructure your organization around more vertically oriented teams. And finally, and probably the most challenging of all, is instilling the right corporate values and culture that are going to support the entire structure. Gunnar talked a little bit about that, but it really comes down to moving beyond compliance and embracing change. Those pillars, they give you the speed, but only a culture that fundamentally embraces change can drive true innovation. That's why I like to say, build for change. If you're a bit of an IT philosopher like I am, you'll notice that the metaphors used for IT systems are fundamentally changing. They used to be based on rigid, fixed things like cities and bridges and buildings. And now, if you watch talks and read papers, all the metaphors are shifting to things that sound a lot more biological, like cells, molecules, and organisms. And the fundamental trait there is this notion of systems that can evolve. Martin Fowler, who's really the guru of microservices, said it best. Said, there is no design at the beginning. You begin by coding a small amount of functionality, adding more functionality, and letting the design shift and shape. What this means is that if you build for change, if you build systems that can evolve quickly, you'll be effectively ready for anything. And being ready for anything is critical to the delivery of a successful open banking environment. And the reason that we need to change so quickly is there's another thing that's evolving. It's not just the technology that's evolving, it's the nature of the customer relationship. And this is at the heart of the open banking proposition. Ann Bowden, the founder of Starling Bank, has a great quote about this. She says, what is innovation? Innovation is all about addressing real issues customers have and delivering something they really want. The thing is, customer needs are ever changing as they go through life stages, as they move through different milestones. What they need from their financial institutions is constantly evolving. And that means that to do open banking properly, our relationships with our customers evolve. In order to allow them to evolve, in order for our systems to support that kind of ongoing rapid evolution, we have to be able to build systems for change, build systems that can evolve with our customers. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Eyal. Fantastic presentation. I love seeing stuff like that because it makes me feel like everything we're talking about on the blog, all these sort of topics, isn't just dogma. We're actually seeing it being implemented in reality. I would also like to add that it seems a lot of what you discussed is really state-of-the-art, very contemporary architecture that is not only applicable for banks, but for a wide variety of other enterprise applications as well. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Right. That's the sort of hidden secret of IT. I like to joke sometimes is that the answer is the same for everybody. Right. The, IT moves in a certain direction. Technology moves in a certain direction. And oftentimes, while there's, of course, customization by sector, the foundational building blocks are the same. I think finance is in a unique position because of the pressures I mentioned earlier. They really are going through a bit of an Uber moment between the GAFAs, the fintechs, the regulation, and frankly, rising consumer expectations. So there is added pressure on them to adopt this stuff faster, but you're seeing the same kind of direction happening across the board in really any sector that uses any kind of serious technology, whether it's manufacturing, telecom, healthcare, et cetera.
Yeah. And looking to the future, you know, you're propagating this idea of advanced service mesh spanning multiple clouds and legacy services. And I've heard some ideas from others and from some Istio creators on that very topic for additional features in the future. How do you see that impacting the vendor space? And which sort of vendors do you see really embracing that idea?
Yeah,
if any?
So, I mean, all of them. I mentioned to you before we started how amazed I am, and I'm a big fan of service mesh at how quickly it's picked up speed and how quick vendors have been to embrace it.
Yep.
Now, was the case with gateways, you're going to see a lot of BS. You're going to see a lot of people who just say they're a mesh and really they're sort of not. And
Yep.
IT professionals should always be on the lookout for that stuff. That's our job. But I think you're going to see continued move in that direction. I don't think it's going anywhere, right? Some people were worried it might not stick. I think it's very much sticking. And vendors are running around trying to figure out how they play nice in this world. Do they duplicate what Istio does? Do they build on top of it? How do they extend things that you get with tools like OpenShift out of the box?
Mm-hmm.
So that's very much where the industry is right now. I don't think that the dust has settled on that at all.
Gotcha. So I guess in your perspective, you know, that your unique value proposition is perhaps how you're differentiating with speed and agility by redesigning these legacy components.
Yes, but I'd like to stress that it is really a culture and org thing too. I think, again, typical of large IT organizations, the vendor is going to come along and say, I have this amazing new service mesh, and many organizations are going to adopt it without really understanding the reasons why. As Martin Fowler and Chris Richardson and other microservice gurus will tell you, adopting microservices without understanding why will only lead to a distributed monolith and increased complexity. I would say adopting service mesh without understanding why is going to exacerbate that problem and make it worse.
Right. We did get some questions in right now. So I think we can open the floor for both Eyal and Gunnar to respond. So this is from Martin. I have a question for both Gunnar and Eyal. I work with basically the same area, but within healthcare. So openness of healthcare information systems. And as we know, healthcare has some of its own data standards for API data sharing. It kind of depends on what region you're in. But he says, Eyal mentioned that true openness is achieved by standardized APIs. I very much agree. Are there any standards for achieving that within banking, or is that part of PSD2? And how do you tackle semantic interoperability, and not only technical interoperability, as in standardizing meaning of information being exchanged so that it can be interpreted correctly by any consumer?
Yeah, Gunnar, I'll let you speak to the regulation.
Yeah, sorry, I should have
handled the second part.
Perfect.
I think that standardization is a difficult thing when you consider the fact that we are now launching products within so wide by the way, areas as pensions and FX and consumer finance and so on. So these products are fundamentally different, and maybe we are the only one also providing it. So when people talk about standardization, they think about the payment API and maybe the account reporting API. But for me, we can do everything in the bank through APIs, and then standardization becomes, maybe a bit difficult and maybe a bit far-fetched. So I think you need to have another take and thinking around it, because see it from this space, we are one of the first movers and we are running really fast. If the banking sector should standardize around some service, then we would have to stop and wait for the other ones, the slow ones, and we would have to help them to get up to our level. And it would simply also take away the market advantage. So I think standardization is a bit difficult if we think that everyone should provide the same thing.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into the second part of the question. The way that they solved the semantic problem is pretty simple. They just really limited the scope. The fact is that most open banking standards around the world, and make no mistake, there are several. There's PSD2 in Europe, but even that fragmented into at least 4 different standards. The UK sort of went their own way, even though it is PSD2 compliant. It's a different regulation. It's and a different standard. You're seeing a whole bunch of stuff in the ASEAN region based on slightly different standards. Some people forked the UK, like Australia and New Zealand, in a slightly different way. So you're seeing a lot of different standards competing, make no mistake. And the question as to whether there will be one global standard is very much, the jury's still out. But from a semantic perspective, they're basically limited to customer, account, transaction, and what did I miss? Product book, right? That's more or less the extent of all of the regulations. So there isn't that much of a semantic problem, because you don't really have that much scope to worry about from a semantic perspective. If you start saying, well, I want to describe the whole bank, and this really comes back to Gunnar's point. If you look at, for example, the buy-in standard, or all the consultancies will have something like a high-performance banking standard. Those are canonical representations of banks. So they're trying to describe the whole thing and say, this is every API for anything a bank would ever want to do. Those things have value, but adopting them as some sort of interoperability standard is probably impossible, as Gunnar described. It's just too much, and you would run into a semantic nightmare. So I think if you're wrestling with a similar problem in healthcare, focus on limiting your scope to something achievable, core entities, the ones that would gain the most value from being interoperable across the ecosystem, and try and focus on things like consent management and trust and authentication flows, redirects, like user experience elements and developer experience elements, rather than a comprehensive semantic model.
Sounds like the optimal response from Mr. Open Banking. I kind of wanted to flip the question back on Gunnar with kind of following Eyal's presentation. Is redesigning legacy components, this whole idea of legacy modernization, is that working in parallel with your open banking initiative? Is this affecting the back-end systems as well? Or is it kind of just a shim surrounding them and wrapping them?
So there are 2 schools in when you talk about digitalization. There is one school often sort of pursued by Accenture and McKinsey and those, saying that you have to digitalize your whole company, from the core and out. But the bank has been computerized since way back, and I mean we have thousands of systems and so on, and if we should change all of those every time a technology shift happens, I mean the only thing we would do would be to trying to cope with change. I am of the opposite sort of opinion that we don't have to change the whole bank. We just have to change the place where it matters for this. I mean, I think that many of the payment systems in Nordea can continue to work in their COBOL programs and DL1 databases and wherever, because they don't really need to change. But in other areas, it's so important that we can change fast. And there we should build our microservices and APIs and all of that stuff, and we should move the applications to cloud. Yeah. But we shouldn't wait for the rest of the bank to change.
Right.
I completely agree. And that lines in perfectly with the best practices around microservices adoption, right? That's why the strangler pattern is such a critical part of microservices adoption. It explicitly says, don't try and just decompose your monolith all at once. Don't break it into pieces. Be very intentional. Be very picky about what you decide to re-implement in a microservice. And a rule of thumb, and I got this from Chris Richardson, who's one of the gurus. He likes to ask, every time you build a microservice, what did you turn off? If the answer is nothing, you probably did something wrong.
As in turn off, what do you mean exactly?
So typically, you're strangling out a legacy monolith. So you've got some sort of old applications. It might not even be that old. It might be a J2E application running on WebLogic or something. And you're trying to migrate to cloud. You're trying to move to a native microservices architecture. So you typically apply something called the strangler pattern, where you take a look at your monolith and you go, which pieces of this change the most often? Which pieces of this are subject to the most unpredictable or sometimes burst-driven scaling requirements? Those are typically good candidates to shave off into a microservice. So you sort of wrap that function in an API, redirect the users to start calling that API, and then take that functionality and implement it into a microservice so that it doesn't get called on the monolith anymore. What most people forget to do is, sometimes, by the way, they don't even think about what they're going to implement. They just say, break the whole thing down into microservices because I like microservices. But even if you were intentional, what a lot of people forget to do is then go back to the monolith and turn off that piece that you moved, right? Like, why did you bother strangling it out if you're going to run that function in two systems? So you absolutely have to have a plan for saying, for every microservice I implement, presuming, of course, it isn't greenfield, that you are trying to retire some sort of legacy system, right, that you turn that function off in the legacy system.
Are there any specific banking services or features that really need more attention than others right now? I mean, because banks process a lot of information. You're doing a lot of different sort of functions and services under the hood. Are there any, like, I don't know, transfers, payments, loans, graphical user interfaces, the APIs that end up giving data to, you know, mobile apps and stuff? Or are there any sort of areas or services that PSD2 aside, regulation aside, need the most attention right now?
I've got a quick one, and I love saying this at the office, and it's a great segue to Gunnar. DX, developer experience. I said it earlier, and I'll say it again. That is not something a lot of banks are good at, and Nordea really stands out as an exception. I signed up for their dev portal, and it's as good as anything from the OBIE. It's as good as Visa. It's as good as MasterCard. There are not a lot of banks that understand the importance of that, and I think that area needs work.
Gotcha.
I remember back in 2016, I read an article from another industry, and it was one statement that caught my eye, and it said, you need an awesome developer portal. And that was the one thing I picked up on. So we actually focused much more on building our developer portal than building our on-prem platform in the beginning, because we really wanted to. And I had a big fight with my IT people and the consultant, because they claimed that the developers, the external, they only want to come to your landing site, grab the code and go away again. And I refused to accept that, because back inside me, I believed in this platformization thing, and that we can actually create something, a community, and we can create engagement and all of that stuff. And it turned out to be true.
That's amazing. Yeah.
But that was a mind shift for many, actually, that to believe in such a development.
Yeah. So yeah, developer experience. For those listeners not familiar with the term, it's just like treating the developer as your user, giving them the same great experience, having great documentation, help guides, even software developer kits, sandboxes for API testing, really transfers well into any sort of touch point that a developer has with an API kind of service, is what we're talking about today. So it seems like that's the main trait that banks can take away with if we were to kind of combine these two. Maybe just some last thoughts on, I mean, you're both coming from separate worlds here. One is very heavily driven by regulation and you're responding to that. One, the CIBC side is more on the market side. Do you foresee any sort of changes with regulation or how your institutions are responding to that, whether it be market driven or regulation driven?
Yeah, I can go first. So sure. Canada is definitely in the process. Mm-hmm. I can't, I can't tell you everything or I'd have to kill you, and I don't know how I do
of course,
that
yes.
video.
I know.
But there has been some public activity. So earlier this year, the government released a review into the merits of open banking. There was a Senate report partway through the year. And without getting to specifics, of course, the large banks are talking about it and trying to understand what the best approach would be for Canadians and for the market. We absolutely consider market stability to be a critical factor in the direction that we choose. There's a lot more I would love to say about that, but frankly, I can't. Definitely, you're going to see that conversation evolve over the next little while in Canada, and it's my job to make sure CIBC is a critical part of that conversation.
Excellent. Yeah. We just had a question come in. Maybe we could answer real quick before we end things off. It's kind of talking about security for banks. So Jefferson is asking, well, there's a lack of homogeneous technical standards for open banking, such as certain security requirements. And this may make the process susceptible to corruption or fraudulent activities. So how do they handle the open banking security challenges?
Yeah. So security is a critical part of the standards. In many ways, some of the earlier front-runner standards, notably the UK, that they sort of jumped out ahead and then realized after the fact that, whoa, we really should have put more security in this thing. And in many ways, the PSD2 region GDPR came after PSD2, and it was a way to, at least from a regulatory perspective, provide some of that protection. Mm-hmm. But I get the impression it's more of a security question, and I can let Gunnar speak to the regulatory side. The technical security, the answer is FAPI. So everybody's adopted FAPI. The newest version of OBIE has really incorporated it at its core. Even the FDX activity, which is a group in the US trying to take a more market-driven approach, also FAPI based. So if you ask the folks at FData and at various groups that are plugged into open banking at the highest levels, there's not a lot they all agree on, but from a security standpoint, they all agree on FAPI.
What is FAPI for people that don't know?
FAPI is basically a security enveloping mechanism that creates a standard, an ISO standard for wrapping messages so they can be traced. Essentially. Now, there's still some tooling you have to do to actually support FAPI, but the point is they agreed on an enveloping standard.
I see. And yeah, Gunnar, maybe from your opinion, what exactly is PSD2 saying with security, and perhaps how are you going beyond that, or at least meeting those security compliances?
Yeah, so PSD2 is saying a lot about the security for the consumer. It's not saying so much about the technical security. So that you need to find out yourself as a bank. So I mean, you're exposing your code 24/7 out there. And of course, you really need to take that seriously. On the other hand, we have been screen scraped by third parties for many years now, and they have been into our systems. They have been re-engineering our internal APIs and so on. So it's not really super new that we are sort of exposed to the other ones. But we anyway made a huge investment in the technical security. I had to pay huge fortune to get a specific consultant best in the world, sort of, just to secure. But we are a first runner, you know. We were using this Drupal thing and so on, and there was some, you know, bugs in it, and so you really need to take it serious. Then when it comes to the security for the users, for the consumers, then that is actually quite extensively regulated in PS2 with something called strong customer authentication, which will probably increase security in the whole market. So, but a lot of convenient solutions like one-click checks out in e-commerce might also be impossible because of that. Yeah. So, I mean, there is a contradiction between convenience and higher security. I mean, that just comes with the territory. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the result of this, I believe that the regulators in Europe will actually be disappointed. I think that PS2 will not turn out the way they had expected, and I think they will soon be thinking about the PS3. Because I think that PS2 will strengthen the position of the banks in a way they hadn't expected.
Oh, okay.
But what do they expect? They force us to invest heavily in new technology, and of course we will try to get a payoff from it.
Right. Of course. Yeah, and it's just like you're saying, you're converting a threat into an opportunity for your business.
Yeah. We just happen to be first out, but I guess other banks will try to follow in the same trend.
Yeah. Well, I'm all on board with PSD2 or PSD3, I should say. It gives us a lot more to talk about, and more open banking live casts in the future, hopefully. You too, thank you so much for jumping online. I mean, Gunnar's in Stockholm, I'm in Seattle, Eyal's in Canada. Where exactly are you, Eyal?
Toronto. Yeah,
Toronto.
We have cities in Canada too.
That's right, and you have territories or state, who knows?
Provinces,
that's right. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Sorry about my lack of international geography. And I'm just gonna do a little sign off here, and we'll call it a day. So this has been our Open Banking Live cast. We have our sponsor for Nordic APIs, Curity. They do well with identity and OAuth. Go to them if you're having those sort of issues, curity.io. Please follow Nordic APIs. We have the Twitter handle there, as well as a newsletter. I operate this bi-weekly digest, and we just send out some articles that we've been working on. And then we keep you updated with event information. Call for speakers is open now for Austin, so you can still get in your proposal if you would like to speak, though spaces are quickly filling up, so I'd recommend you do so soon. We keep call for speakers open throughout the year for Austin, Stockholm, as well as the LiveCast too. So if you have any interest in speaking in one of these events, you can submit at our call to speakers link or contact us here for more information. So yeah, any final thoughts, you two? It's been a great hour of discussion.
Yeah, really great.
Yep, awesome. Just wanted to thank you for having us today. It's been a great event.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Thanks for coming back.
Anytime.
All right, everybody. Signing off. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.